There's been a lot of talk about tariffs and framing them as being all negative and threatening to raise prices with no benefits. However, I can say as someone who has worked heavily with global companies, including recently one based in India, tariffs are pretty much a necessity. Let's start off with what exactly a tariff is. Very simply put, a tariff is a tax put on a good, typically by the government. There can be a lot of reasons to use tariffs, but for the purpose of this discussion, I'll be focusing in on a specific class of goods and only incoming from certain countries. I will also cover the benefits of how Trump plans to utilize tariffs, as I think there are numerous positives to enforcing tariffs across the board. In fact, more than I thought before I started doing research for this topic. So, what do the mandatory tariffs actually look like? I think that any technologically advanced products that come out of companies headquartered in countries with deflated costs of living should have massive tariffs placed on them, with two of the most glaring countries being China and India. What is an example of one of these products? The easiest and most readily available example of this would be cars, specifically ones from China. China mandates U.S. companies to work in partnership with a Chinese-owned company in order to be able to sell in the Chinese market. While China was previously unable to compete with the United States in the vehicle market, these companies then learn as much as possible from the US-based companies, stealing intellectual property and methodologies, then spinning off their own brands to compete with lower costs to create the product, then ship them out globally. This is partially possible because China has artificially suppressed the value of the yuan, while the US has seen constant inflation to the US dollar. This was never considered a problem when China was a third world country that posed no threat to the United States, where we positioned ourselves as exporting high value goods which could not be replicated in China. And any place that could compete had similar costs of living like the EU or Japan. However, in today's world, and going back to the car example, now, cars from China are just as good, if not better, than most US created vehicles, and a brand new, fully electric vehicle would cost only about $10,000, give or take. Compare that to a Tesla Model 3, which sits around $30,000. It's not a very hard choice as to which vehicle most people would purchase. And if you say looks matter, people actually purchased the Honda Element at one point in time. To dive a little bit deeper into the root of the issue in the cost of living disparity, when you take a look at comparative cost of living between China and the United States, you get a stark contrast and understand why the prices can have such great variance. Taking a brief look at the numbers, the US has, on average, a 143% higher cost of living, but that doesn't even illustrate the whole picture accurately. I have highlighted a specific subset of these price comparisons, which I would call baseline cost of living, such as food, transportation, and utilities. And a brief review of these items reveals that the actual price to live is actually closer to a 300% difference, with certain line items being 500 or 600% more expensive in the United States than in China. With that being said, it makes all the sense why a baseline, we'll call it desirable, electric car is 1/3 the price coming out of China. When we were only leveraging China for essentially slave labor, this is great because it reduces what is typically the most expensive part of the supply chain, human capital. So much so that it has been cheaper to pay for shipping raw materials to and finished products from China instead of paying Americans to do these jobs. However, As soon as China is capable of competing on the global market with the US in products that we export, this becomes a problem because China will constantly be able to undercut us and decimate our exports in sectors like automobiles. Now, if you think it's a great idea to allow competition and that it is generally good and will lead to better products and prices, I actually agree with you 100% in theory. However, in today's world, aside from the reality that this would completely decimate US exports, driving vehicles and relying on electronics from your rivals is probably not a good idea. Already, we have seen global stories of Israel infiltrating the Hezbollah supply chain, installing explosive instrumentation in and detonating pagers, killing at least 32 and severely injuring thousands more, as well as U.S. military weaponry and other highly sensitive technology with components manufactured in China having backdoors built into them, allowing China or anyone backdoor entry into United States military weapons systems. And these are just two examples that we are aware of. So although I may be informed enough to keep away from these low-cost goods myself, I highly doubt that most people are even aware of these stories and the dangers that you could be exposing yourself to when buying these types of items. So now switching to blanket tariffs. Why are they good? What is the goal here? First and foremost is to level the playing field. With the US having such a high cost of living, it is the goal of a lot of companies to gain access to the US market, where they can charge what would be impossibly high prices in their home country. In the example of cars, they can completely undercut the US automakers with a superior product for less money. Imagine instead of $10,000, they charge $20,000. That's still $10K cheaper than a Tesla. And they still are able to take back an additional 100% markup on the vehicle in pure profit to their home country. And speaking of Tesla Model 3, it is estimated to cost around $28,000 to create one. So when you put all these numbers side by side on a graph, it's obvious why China would decimate us in the auto market. And it's not an exaggeration to say that gaining a foothold in the American market can easily 100x the valuation of companies located in other countries because of the benefit that producing products in a low monetary inflation country and selling them into a high monetary inflation country provides. Because of this, tariffs are literally mandatory to be competitive. However, that doesn't help with global exports. But encouraging domestic production does, which coincidentally is the next benefit of blanket tariffs. Imagine you're a company taking part in the global supply chain as it exists today. You gather all of your materials, which are cheaper to produce, from global economies, which hit a 20% tariff when they enter the United States. You then ship these materials, once they are gathered, to a country with cheap labor, we'll say China in this instance. Then, on return for those goods to be sold in the US, the goods incur another 20% tariff. This equates to a total of a 40% price increase incurred by the company on goods sourced and manufactured abroad, which is not sustainable. Even if they were to try and pass that on to the consumer, new companies would arise who would source everything from the US and create everything in the US, who would easily be able to outperform them in the market. For this reason, companies would have almost no option but to begin producing their products in the US. For the next point, let's think all the way back to COVID. As a side effect of moving production back into the US, This would also reduce the necessity to rely on other countries for our essential goods. Remember when there were shortages of toilet paper, food, masks, COVID tests, and more? Some of these were induced by panic buying. However, as the pandemic carried on, there were significant supply chain issues caused by reduced workforce at docks and in the supply chain in general, both in the United States and abroad. By producing more internally in the US, we reduce the risk of having to rely on other countries continuing to produce the same amount of product and deliver it through complex supply chains, especially during times of increased demand where those other countries may keep product for themselves instead of shipping it abroad. Another benefit that may not be overtly obvious is that this would promote, at least at some level, competition and allow challenger companies to arise. In the current market, incumbents in certain verticals have a nearly impossible barrier of entry. How is a new company supposed to compete with global firms that are able to leverage scale and supply chains to produce their products at rock bottom prices? While they would still have to compete with the scale of these larger companies, they could at least find local supply chains here in the US, greatly reducing the bar to entry. As a personal example, I once came up with a product that I thought was pretty ingenious. However, it was nearly impossible to find any sort of textile company located here in the US to produce it, as almost every apparel company has all of their products made in China, completely wiping out that industry in the United States. Another less immediately apparent outcome about tariffs is the ability to threaten to impose them on countries to get them to make policy and macroeconomic decisions that you could not otherwise get them to take. For example, Trump recently threatened both Canada and Mexico with 25% tariffs on all imports unless they took actual, meaningful steps to curb both illegal immigration and the flow of drugs, especially fentanyl, into the United States. This saw immediate panic in both countries, sparking the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, to call Trump 2 hours after he announced the plan for these tariffs to be implemented on day one. Then Trudeau followed up with a trip to see Trump in person at Mar-a-Lago. A fairly obvious but under-acknowledged benefit would be the massive reduction of emissions with reduced shipping between the United States and China, as well as ensuring that every step in the supply chain is ethical. First, on the shipping front, companies don't actually do all this back and forth shipping because it's good for the environment. They do it because it's cheaper. With China being a huge exporter, they account for 1/3 of the total global carbon dioxide emissions. Although we know CO2 can be very dangerous, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to emissions. Nitrogen oxide and sulfur are also emitted during the transportation of these goods, leading to extreme health issues. One study found that just 15 of the largest ships contributed to more pollution than the entire global supply of cars, with the total pollution from shipping leading to an estimated 60,000 deaths annually, as well as a correlated $330 billion in healthcare costs related to lung and heart disease annually. And then there are the ethical considerations. The most memorable of these was probably Apple and the use of nets at their Foxconn factories in China, which were installed to prevent workers from jumping out the windows of the factory to end their lives because of the horrible conditions that they were forced to endure. However, there have been many other high-profile incidents, including the imprisonment of Uyghur Muslims in China who are being used as slave labor. The conditions are so bad that they are literally referred to as internment camps by the US government. With such humanitarian rights violations as a lack of free will to leave the premises, being escorted around by police, and being forced to learn Mandarin Chinese and undergo indoctrination classes. It is estimated that over 1 million Uyghurs are being held in this manner. And the final example will take us out of China and to Africa, where 20,000 people can be found working in a single mine, and where 74% of the world's cobalt is produced, which is necessary for the creation of the batteries in smartphones and electric cars. What is so bad about these circumstances is that this work is not only extremely dangerous because of the conditions in the mines, but cobalt is actually extremely toxic to both touch and breathing in. And the people mining the cobalt are in constant contact with these materials day in and day out, earning no more than a few dollars a day. I think anything we can do to eliminate any of these injustices would be a net positive. The final point I want to cover is that implementation of tariffs would encourage the creation of more jobs in the United States. This seems pretty self-explanatory. However, if doing business outside of the US becomes too prohibitively expensive, then companies will just have to move their businesses back to the United States, thus creating more jobs. And I'm fairly bullish that the dangerous conditions previously mentioned will not be imposed on US residents. Firstly, because of regulations, but also with the advancements in robotics, large portions of these processes could be automated in factories with minimal human interaction. The problem is, companies hate investing in infrastructure as that has a large upfront cost that they try to avoid at all costs. With all the negative headlines and doom and gloom I have seen about tariffs recently, I hope that I've been able to shine a bit of a light on a few of the reasons why I believe tariffs will actually be needed and could actually have a positive impact for the United States. If you made it this far, why not subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.